to turn to Revelation chapter 2. Revelation chapter 2. Read verses 8 through verse 11. This is the Lord's message to the church of Smyrna. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews, and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Smyrna, like Ephesus, was a very large and affluent port city, second only to Ephesus in the area. And it was 35 to 40 miles north of Ephesus along the coast of the Aegean Sea. Today it's Izmir, and it's Turkey's second largest port after Istanbul. Politically, Smyrna was very proud to be a part of the Roman Empire, and patriotism to Rome was very fervent. So politically, they were adverse to Christianity. Smyrna was a place of emperor worship, where the worship of Roman emperors was done with much devotion, and they would say Caesar is Lord. In the beginning, the emperor worship was really nothing more than a demonstration of gratitude to Rome, but of course it turned into much more than that. It turned into worship. Also, so we see politically they would be adverse to Christianity. Also in Smyrna was a temple to the goddess Roma, a temple for the worship of the spirit of Rome. So Smyrna, the city of Smyrna, was marked by loyalty to a political system that was against Christianity, and a general spirit that was also opposed to Christianity. And working with these, there was a very, very large group, a large population of Jews that hated Christians because they saw them as a cult. So everything about Smyrna was contrary to and in opposition to Christianity. But it was in this wealthy, secular, pagan, politically hostile city that the Lord planted one of his churches to be a lighthouse. From the letter to the church in Smyrna, we see that they were undergoing affliction, poverty. They were experiencing slander and ridicule. They were a persecuted church. And from what is said in the letter, we gather that the conditions in Smyrna, which were much more hostile than they were in Ephesus, and that Ephesus wasn't by any means friendly toward or welcoming of Christianity, but Smyrna was much more hostile than even Ephesus. The letter is very brief, and it's very encouraging. There is no word of rebuke to the Smyrna church, only praise from the Lord, only consolation from the Lord, but no rebuke of the church in Smyrna. And again, like all these letters, Christ begins by calling attention to himself. And that's where it always begins. We need to get our attention. We need to get our focus upon him. In verse 8, we see he presents himself as the first and the last, that which was dead and is alive. So the letter begins with Christ calling their attention and focus away from their troubles. They had plenty of them. He's saying, focus upon me. We see in chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, Christ appeared to John and said, "Fear not, I am the first and the last. I am he that liveth and was dead. Behold, I am alive forevermore." And that's how he presents himself to this church in Smyrna. He is the first, and he is the last. That is, he is the source. He is the ultimate reason. It means that he lacks nothing. He lacks nothing. It means that he is unlimited. He is everything. He is eternal. He is supreme. And that's how he directs this church to view him. When he says, "I am the first and the last, he that was dead and is alive," he says, before there was anything, I was. And in the end, I will be. And I will be what I was, and I will be what I am. So he's immutable. Hebrews 12, verse 2, he's presented as the author and finisher of our faith. In other words, the first and the last. Everything finds its answer in him. And this church needed to hear this. Again, they're experiencing, as we'll see here in a little bit, they're experiencing tribulation, poverty, blasphemy. They're experiencing all these things, and they need to know that everything finds its answer in Christ. So they're to gravitate toward him, and so are we. Every phase of our life is to be inspired by him. He is victorious. He said, "I was dead, but am alive." He's victorious, and they would have victory in him. So that's how Christ presents himself. And then we come to the situation and the circumstances of this church. In verse 9 and 10, we see the circumstances of the church. What is said in verse 9 is present tense. "I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan." Everything in that verse is present tense. It's what they were experiencing at that moment. In verse 10, everything's future tense. Notice, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. So everything in verse 10 is future tense. So we see their present situation, and we see the future situation of the Smyrna church is foretold. So let's look first of all at their present situation. And you'll notice the words there in verse 9, tribulation, poverty, and blasphemy. That's what they were experiencing as John wrote this letter, as it was dictated to him from Christ. So they have affliction. The word tribulation is the Greek word translated affliction. It conveys the idea of anguish, being burdened, being troubled, in this case as a result of persecution. So that word tribulation speaks of a result of their persecution. They were being grievously afflicted. Their persecution was causing them pain. It was causing them suffering. They were under much distress and anguish. Now, the Bible, of course, declares that tribulation is to be expected in the life of a child of God. Jesus promised it. Notice in John chapter 16. John chapter 16 and verse 33. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation. Be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. And that's how Christ presented himself, as the overcomer. I was dead, I am alive. So the church of Smyrna was being exhorted to be of good cheer. But again, we shall have tribulation. We see in Acts 14:22 that we'll enter into heaven through much tribulation. So this church was experiencing grief and suffering as a result of their persecution. The next thing that's mentioned here in Revelation 2 and verse 9 is the word poverty. And the word translated poverty there means beggarly indigence. Beggarly indigence. So it's describing a level of poverty in which real hardship and deprivation is experienced. It's the lacking of the very basics and all the comforts of life. So those who made up this body of Christ in Smyrna were brought to extreme poverty, and again through persecution. So they were miserably poor. They weren't just poor, they were miserably poor. And they are in a city that has great possessions, but they're not in a poor city. They're in a city that is very wealthy, but they themselves are suffering poverty, lacking the very basics of life. And again, this is a result of the political system. It was a result of the religious system, the result of just the spirit of that city. And the third thing that we see here in verse 9 that they were experiencing was slander. The word used is blasphemy. Of course, it speaks of evil speaking. They were evil spoken of. It speaks of defamation. speaks of misrepresentation, damage done to another's reputation by speech. And so this church was experiencing much slander as well. And the source of the slander was, again, verse 9, them which say, again, they make a claim on the basis of coming through Abraham, just like we read in John chapter 8, that they are Jews, that they are followers of Christ. So the slander is coming from the Jewish people. And then it says, and are not. They claim to be followers of Christ, but they are not. They are not followers of Christ. But then it says, but are the synagogue. Now, synagogue is gathering together. Gathering together. And they are the synagogue of Satan. They gather together. That is, these Jews who are slandering them for Satan. In other words, they're tools of Satan. And this church is suffering greatly under satanic attack. And who Satan was using were those who claimed to be followers of Christ. That's who Satan was using. Not deniers of Christ, but those who claim to be followers of Christ. Now, in light of all this, Jesus says there in verse 9, I know thy works, and tribulation, and poverty, and I know the blasphemy. I know, is what Christ is saying. This is much more than Jesus being aware of their tribulation and their poverty and their being the victims of slander. It's much more than Jesus just being aware of it. He says, I know. He says, I know by personal experience. I too have experienced those things. He is saying, I understand what you are going through. You are experiencing affliction. You are experiencing poverty and slander. And I know empathetically what you are experiencing. And so this is Christ feeling sympathetically. It is Christ feeling empathetically what the people of the Lord were experiencing. It's the compassion of Christ for this church. And again, it's Christ entering into their needs, entering into their feelings, entering into the suffering of His people. Christ is telling them, I am present with you in your tribulation. I am present with you in your poverty. I am present with you in the slander that you are experiencing. So Christ is declaring, when He says, I know, He's declaring His personal interest in them. He's declaring His personal care for them. And perhaps more importantly, He's declaring His supervision of it all. He's in control of it all. He basically is saying, I've been through much worse. I've been through much worse. And though you are going through what is bigger than you, it's not bigger than me. I am the first, and I am the last. So that was the present situation. Tribulation, poverty, blasphemy. But then the Lord moves to the future in verse 10. Again, you notice the words, thou shalt, shall, ye shall, and I will. Everything is future. Christ is saying, I am the first, and I am the last, the forever alive one, and I know not only what you're going through, but I know what you're going to go through. In relation to their future, notice these words: suffer, prison, tried, tribulation, death. Not much of a future. But those are the words he uses to describe their future. He is telling them that difficult times are on the horizon. You are having difficulty now. And things aren't going to get any better. In fact, they're going to get worse. This is what Christ is telling them of their future. He says, things which thou shalt suffer. Their future was one of suffering. Their present was one of suffering. Suffer speaks of pain. It speaks of loss. It speaks of distress. And then he says, verse 10, the devil shall. So Satan is the instigator. And what follows the devil shall is the words prison, tried, tribulation, and death. So all of these things are instigated by Satan. They are the result of satanic attack. Many of them would be confined, put in bondage, and the purpose of this was to be tried. That's what it says there in verse 10. And this would continue for 10 days. So he's speaking of something very specific that the church of Smyrna would experience. But none will be afflicted past God's appointed time. That's still so today. God appoints who will suffer. God appoints what they will suffer. And God appoints how long. And nothing can change it. In other words, God is in control. So here's a church. They're being persecuted. And Christ tells them concerning their future, they would continue to be persecuted. But this is where the Lord placed them. He placed them in a city that was politically adverse to Christianity. He placed them in a place where the Spirit was adverse to Christianity. He placed them in a place where they were hated. That's a good place for the Lord's church. And you see it all through the New Testament. You don't see God placing His churches. This is a modern thought process that we need to find comfortable places and we'll start a mission there. We'll start a church there. That's modern thinking. That's not how it was all through the New Testament. And it's modern thinking today. Well, the neighborhood's getting bad. We're going to have to move somewhere more pleasant. That's modern thinking. That's not biblical thinking. God placed His churches in wicked places all through the book of Acts. And it makes sense because the purpose of the church is to be a lighthouse. So you place them in dark places. You don't place them in places of light. You place them in dark places. That's contrary to modern thought. Then we look at Christ's encouragement and instruction. By way of encouragement, when He mentions their poverty, He says, "But thou art rich." You are so poor that you do not have the basics of life. But Christ says, I remind you, you're rich. You're rich. They were rich toward God. It is what Paul spoke of in 2 Corinthians 6 in verse 10 as having nothing and yet possessing all things. And that's God's people. They may be poverty-stricken, but in reality, they're rich. Poor in the matter of earthly goods, but rich in spiritual possessions, rich in grace. This is what Ephesians 1:3 talks about. This is what Romans 8:17 talks about. He says, so they're experiencing poverty, but don't forget how rich you are. And that's our tendency. And then he gives instruction. Verse 10, he says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Though there was suffering in their near future, they were not to fear the sufferings, nor were they to fear the future. He is telling them in verse 10 that the affliction of poverty and that the slander that they were experiencing are not going to improve anytime soon. But they were not to fear. They were not to fear the future. You look at the Lord's churches, this has been going on for a long time. They are filled with fear concerning the future. If there is a group of people that ought not have fear of the future, it's God's people. But perhaps the most fearful people on the planet are the Lord's people. Scared of what's going to happen. Oh, do you know they're building warehouses to put God's people in? Well, they might be. I don't know. Don't let it concern you. Don't let it concern you. Do you know that one day they're going to come and arrest us? Probably. But you're not to fear that. You're not to let that control your service to the Lord and the life that you live. He's telling them what's going to happen. You are going to be in prison. Some of you are going to die. But fear not. Fear not the things which thou shalt suffer. So if this church had a problem, this would have been their biggest problem, fear. Fear not. Fear not. Fear is a problem. Fear is a real problem. Fear is a debilitating and crippling power. It's one of Satan's most dominant weapons. And Satan will use it to torment and dictate feelings and dictate behavior. Fear is a powerful, powerful weapon of Satan. Fear will cloud the mind, making it difficult to think and difficult to focus on the right things. We read in 2 Timothy 1 in verse 7, the spirit of fear. The spirit of fear. God has not given us the spirit of fear. And it's declared that, again, it's declared that this spirit of fear does not come from God. It comes from somewhere else. And it's suggested that it works against a healthy mind. So fear has a very powerful effect upon perception. It has stripping power. It'll rob you of joy. It'll rob you of peace. It'll rob you of assurance. Fear has paralyzing power. Again, we see in the book of John, many did not speak of Christ because of fear. It paralyzed them. And so the Lord's message to this church is fear not. You're going to suffer. You're going to be imprisoned. Some of you are going to die. But fear not, is what Christ is telling them. And all through the Word of God, we are exhorted, fear not. And almost every time when we are exhorted to fear not, what follows is a reason, and the reason is God. Fear not, for I will. Fear not, for I. God is the reason. That's why He calls their attention to Himself. He's the first and the last. I'm everything you need. Keep your eyes on me. Do not fear. This is what He's telling this church. Fear not. I am. That's what Christ said when He appeared to John there in Revelation chapter 1, verse 17. Fear not, I am. I am. So we're not to fear. And He's the reason. He's the reason. He's the reason that we're not to fear. We need no other reason. Then we see that faithfulness and perseverance is encouraged. So here's a church. They're suffering. And the Lord comes, sends them a letter, and tells them it's going to get worse. You're suffering now, but you're going to suffer more. Your suffering is great, but it's going to get greater. And He encourages them. Be thou faithful unto death. That's their calling. That's our calling. That's the calling of all God's people. Be thou faithful. Be thou faithful. We're not here to straighten the world out politically. That's not the purpose of the Lord's church. We're to be faithful. We're to be faithful. Faithfulness implies a duty. You have to be faithful to something. So when He says, be thou faithful, the implication is they have a duty. They have a duty to God. And affliction, and poverty, and slander, and more suffering on the horizon does not change their duty. Does not change their calling. Does not change their obligation. To be faithful implies that one has an obligation. It implies that one has a responsibility. Be thou faithful. Faithfulness to God and the things of God was their duty. Even in the midst of tribulation, in poverty, in blasphemy, they were to be faithful. What am I to do when tribulation comes? Be thou faithful. Well, what if they take everything? Be thou faithful. Well, what if they speak lies against me? Be thou faithful. That's our duty. That's our duty. Our duty is not to get as many people as we can on our side. We're simply to be faithful. That's our duty. The phrase, be thou faithful, covers all seasons of life. When we're young and when we're old, we're to be faithful. We're to be faithful. That means we're to be loyal. Loyal to God. Means we're to be constant. We're to be true. We're to be devoted, steadfast, dedicated, committed, reliable, even if it means death. Even if it means death. Pastored a lot of different people through the years, and it's very sad when you have to say of some, well, you can't really depend on them. You can't really depend on them. That's sad. That's a failed life. That's a lack of faithfulness. So, in the face of what was yet to come, they were to be faithful. In a wicked city, they were to be faithful. Again, he had predicted, the Lord had foretold of, humanly speaking, a dismal future. But he says, you be faithful. And what is the best way to be faithful in the future? There's only one way, and that's to be faithful in the present. If you're not faithful in the present, what in the world makes someone think they'll be faithful in the future? But people talk like that all the time. They're not going to lose their job. They're not going to cross their spouse or whatever. But when it comes to time to die for Christ, I'll lay down my life for Christ. You won't even come to church for Christ. And you're going to try to convince people that you're going to lay down your life? I don't think so. Don't think so. The way to be faithful in the future is to be faithful in the present. He tells them, be thou faithful. Be thou faithful. No matter what the circumstances, be thou faithful. No matter what's on the horizon, be thou faithful. No matter who's in office, no matter what the political atmosphere is, be thou faithful unto death. Be thou faithful even if it means your own death. In every duty God appoints to His churches, our obligation is to be faithful. That's our obligation, to be faithful. Notice it does not say, be thou faithful until death. That's not what it says. Unto. Unto. To the dying point. Be thou faithful. Be thou faithful even if it means your own death. You be faithful to God. It is loyalty to Christ at any cost. That is our individual obligation. Collectively as a church, that is our obligation. That is our call. To be loyal to Christ at any cost. For the Smyrna church, they were faithful. And there was tribulation, and there was poverty, and there was blasphemy. So all these people who say, you be faithful, and good things will happen. Well, not necessarily. They were faithful, and it brought them tribulation, and poverty, and blasphemy, and their future wasn't any better. But they were to remain faithful. Be thou faithful. That is a commitment to allegiance to God. God's people need to be very careful where they align in anything in this world. I don't care what it is. Better be careful. Because we have one allegiance, and that's to God. We're to be constant in loyalty to God. Exact and unwavering in obedience to God. Faithful to God. Faithful to the truth. Faithful in our duties. Faithful stewards of what God has left us. That's rare. Proverbs 20 and verse 6 says, a faithful man who can find? The implication is he's rare. Faithful people are rare. It's not the norm. It's not the norm. A faithful man who can find. So God has left us here to be faithful. Churches must not lose sight of that, because churches today are being told by the world that they must be accommodating and accepting of everybody and everything. The Lord did not call us to be accommodating and accepting. He did call us to be faithful. That's what He called us to be, is faithful. Churches today are expected to be appealing to the world. You have to appeal to the masses. The Lord did not call His churches to appeal to the masses. He called them to be faithful. To be faithful. The world today expects churches to be non-offensive. God did not call us to be non-offensive. He called us to be faithful. Again, we're not to purposely give offense. But if you're going to be faithful to God, guess what? You're going to offend some folks along the way. But that's our calling, to be faithful. The Smyrna church, when the Jews began to slander them, they didn't call a conference to make concessions to the Jews. They were just faithful to what God called them to be. We need to be faithful. We read of Hananiah in Nehemiah 7 verse 2. He was a faithful man and feared God. What a testimony. He was a faithful man and feared God. In Nehemiah 13:13, we read of those who were counted faithful. Who were counted faithful. Here's what happens today. Faithfulness becomes more and more rare all the time. So what do? We redefine faithful. Because after all, we don't want to have nobody in the church that's faithful, so we'll just redefine the word. You can redefine it all you want to. It doesn't change it. Doesn't change it. We're to be faithful unto death. We read in Proverbs 11:13 of a faithful spirit. A faithful spirit. Paul said concerning Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:17, faithful in the Lord. And he said of Onesimus in Colossians 4 verse 9, a faithful and beloved brother. Paul advised Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:2, and the things that thou hast heard of me, the same commit to faithful men. Nowhere are we to commit these things to unfaithful men. But you commit them to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Well, if you just give so-and-so a job in the church, they'll be faithful. That's backwards. That's backwards. You be faithful first. That the world is people are messed up in their thinking. We read of Sylvanus, a faithful brother, 1 Peter 5 verse 2. Faithfulness equals usefulness. We want to be useful in the Lord's work. So we're called upon to live lives of godliness and faithfulness, and we have everything we need to accomplish it. 2 Peter 1 verse 3, according as His divine power hath given us all things that pertain unto life and godliness. We're to be faithful. And God has given us everything we need to be faithful. And where the Lord places His church, whatever city that might be, however wicked it might be, they're to be faithful. They're to be faithful. When things get bad, the church isn't to look for a new town to go to. They're to be faithful. When God tells them to move, that's something different, but they're to be faithful. And then we see, as in all the letters, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to His churches. There's a call to hear what Christ is saying, a call to receive what Christ is saying. And then there's God-given honor to those who are faithful. To those who are faithful. God will honor faithfulness. But again, faithfulness does not necessarily mean your life is going to be easy. It could bring more suffering. Probably will. Could bring more persecution. Probably will. May result in death. Be thou faithful. That's the call to all of us individually, and that is the call to each and every one of the Lord's churches. Okay, Ben, if you'll come and